A job advertisement recently has provoked a frisson of excitement in the Nintendo community commentariat at the potential of cross platform Sony games raining down on high to the Switch 2. Now, I don't really think that this advertisement indicates that any major moves in this direction are even necessarily on their mind in any particular way, and even if it did, I think it will be a long time before top tier exclusives wash up on Nintendo's little console that could, especially if Sony have any ambition to enter the handheld market themselves. So this is not a video arguing that in the short term this is likely. However, in the long term, I wonder if there might be substantial benefit to both Sony and Microsoft of going cross-platform, even though for Nintendo there is absolutely no benefit in doing so. So let's break it down. To understand why this is the case, we need to talk about a completely different company in a completely different industry, and indeed a company that younger people in the audience may have no knowledge or direct recollection of. We need to talk about Kodak. Time was, Kodak were almost synonymous with camera film, and their products were iconic because if you wanted to take photos, there was a decent chance you were going to have a Kodak camera and use Kodak film. The Kodak moment advertisement passed into common parlance for something that deserved a picture taking of it. And Kodak were no slouches in the industry. Kodak invented the first digital camera. They had the technology that was going to reshape the world of photography. But releasing this camera would absolutely obliterate their highly profitable business selling film. So they sat on the technology. As it turned out, other people quickly got there anyway. Kodak lost not just their film business, but in every respect ceased to become relevant, and the company ultimately filed for bankruptcy in 2012. Would making the shift to digital before anyone else have saved the company? Maybe and maybe not. First mover advantage only lasts so long, and long term they may never have been able to compete with multifunction devices like phones with cameras, but it would at least have given them a fighting chance. Now, Sony and Microsoft are very different beasts in many different ways, but what they have in common with Kodak is that I think they're looking at the video game business as currently iterated, and they're seeing, if not the end of the road, then certainly the first road sign warning. Here's the problem. While there is a huge gulf between the current top spec PlayStation 5 Pro visuals and photorealism, we're entering that uncanny valley where everything looks a little bit wrong until it is finally photorealistic. Processing power and speed can also be ramped up, but these consoles are juicy as it stands. And given how expensive everything looks set to become in the coming years, the market for high-priced consoles looks less certain in the short term than it once was. I'm sure Sony will be able to sell a PlayStation 6 even at eye-watering prices, but what about PlayStation 7? What about PlayStation 8? It's not that these won't represent significant markups, but that for many consumers, it may feel like those increases don't feel as essential as previous console revisions. There will always be a market for those people who want the absolute cutting edge of technology, but those people are probably in the PC market, not the console space. If successive generations have less take-up of new consoles, the 6 to 7 year replacement cycles that have driven the industry until now are going to be harmed, and at the same time the number of ways to play games is increasing massively. Whereas once high-end games could be played on your television, and while there were handhelds, these were massively underpowered, now tablets and phones are commonplace. Pricing themselves out of the market with high-end consoles would be a more problematic option still for Sony and Microsoft. Now, if Sony or Microsoft were Kodak, this may represent an existential problem, but both companies are highly diversified megacorporations. They both sell phones. Microsoft is a big player in the PC space, while Sony is massive in the film and TV space, but their fortunes are not tied to the ongoing adoption of home consoles as a primary manner of consuming game content. However, to justify the price of their increasingly expensive AAA games division, they will need these things to sell to the broadest possible audience. Opening the titles up to being cross-platform will surely be problematic in the short term. Yes, more people will buy the games, but because they're not on bespoke platforms, the loyalty may not be locked in the same way, the margin may be lower, and people won't be as invested in the pricey technology, which does drive profits for Sony and Microsoft. However, this is less of an issue if the market is expanding because the total number of gameplay devices will be growing, and the market can hardly fail to expand since the technology to output better than PlayStation 4 graphics is now pretty commonplace in most smartphones in people's pockets across much of the world. If Sony or Microsoft can build a new business model, they can have confidence weathering the storm. I think it will look different for each of the two companies, though. For Microsoft, they are evidently doubling down on Game Pass, which provides them with consistent income with no generation to generation spikes and dips. Yes, they can try and sell their own equipment, consoles, tablets, and phones, but it's not essential to Game Pass's success that people play on a Microsoft device, merely advantageous to them. In Sony's case, my hunch is that the PlayStation technology will become ever more integrated with television technology. In a couple of decades, I could imagine that alongside surround sound and 4K output, the ability to play video games natively on the television will simply become part of the offer of new television sets, and if Sony becomes the default in this space, then they will have a future for their games to years to come, and of course, they will have the ecosystem that will guarantee them a decent cut of the pie. This may also help Sony in the consumer electronics space, which currently is one of their least profitable endeavors due to the tight competition. I'm not saying that these trajectories for Microsoft or Sony are locked in by any means. Evidently, they will want to maintain a profitable status quo where they can, but it makes sense to have a long-term pivot in mind. For Nintendo, though, the situation is very different, and this is why I think it's hugely unlikely that we will see Nintendo content on other platforms. Certainly, I'd give it my lowest forecast 10% that we will see anything Nintendo elsewhere this decade. While superficially Nintendo's roughly 18 trillion yen market capitalization isn't far off the Sony Group's roughly 24 trillion yen, this is due partly to a period of high profitability from Nintendo and investor optimism for the dawn of the Switch 2 era and the forthcoming films. If Nintendo's core console business goes south, though, they don't have a backup console system, their IP expansion plan is developing but still at a fraction of their total business, and it will be very difficult to bounce back soon without going through another round of development, including, of course, game development, which these days tends to mean most of a decade for AAA titles to be put out. If they lost their hardware business, could they adapt? Well, sure, their core games and IPs are pretty popular, but they would lose the ability to hyper-optimize for any individual console. They would lose the benefits of having their own platform, and so the profitability of those games would also plummet. During the glory days of Sega in the 90s, a time when the company appeared to be in some kind of bizarre civil war between the American and Japanese divisions of itself, pushing different 32-bit consoles onto the market, the company still managed to consistently put out absolutely superb first-party titles with a regularity that far eludes them now. Adapting games for multiple consoles is time-consuming, and the margins on those games is obviously going to be less than if you own the hardware, and Nintendo would ultimately lose its ability to innovate in terms of pure hardware as well. Even if mouse mode isn't exactly your cup of tea, Nintendo still does push the envelope very significantly with hardware as well as software, and this would be harder to do as effectively just another third party. Furthermore, having an integrated platform makes it easier for Nintendo to cross-promote their wares. Sega's success in Sonic doesn't necessarily lead to greater success for Yakuza, Echo the Dolphin, or other franchises besides, but with Nintendo's ability to hold attention, it can cross-promote other franchises, Mario and Zelda and Pikmin, all at the same time. That's not to say that Nintendo has no plan B. Aside from their IP expansion projects, I expect that they would return to toys and continue to develop out from there, so I can't see the company having their own Kodak moment anytime soon. They also hold huge cash reserves to insulate themselves against exactly this kind of crisis. However, my expectation is that even if Sony and Microsoft move towards an industry standard format, that Nintendo would continue for a long time to do their crazy things on the edge of the industry. If you enjoyed this video, consider sharing and commenting, and there's some cool early access stuff on the Patreon. If not, I'm still grateful you're here, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.